Chapter 56, The Backstory, Part 2, Hanyu's POV. Hanyu could only gape at his master. "Married?" he squeaked. "You were married?" When Antony's voice came, it sounded strangely young and vulnerable. I was, however, briefly, and it was wonderful. Our wedding day was one of my happiest. Theodora performed the ceremony. She was lord of her own estates, so she had the authority. Hanyu remembered Kenta's story about Lord Theodora marrying Chihiro to his lover. How many marriages had she performed? Did they always remind her of Antony and Valerius? It was a small, rushed wedding, but there were enough witnesses that no one could dispute that it had happened, or else I think my father might have tried to cover it up, Antony continued, running his thumb under one of his fingers over and over again. The idea of a royal using a human for sex was considered crass, but feasible. But marriage was unthinkable, so much so that it had never been officially outlawed. Theodora saw to it that Valerius was legally registered as the husband of a prince and a member of the royal family, and we thought it would be enough to protect him from any further interference. Antony, Lord of the Gods, married to a human. Yes, he hadn't quite been a god yet, but the thought was still staggering. Hanyu wondered dizzily what the priests would have made of it. There were stories of gods favoring humans, of course, and large portions of his training had been devoted to learning how to court that favor. But to marry one, like an equal? His master was still speaking. It put an end to my bid for the throne, of course, but that didn't matter to me, not compared to him. I thought my father would protect us, and we would be allowed to move to the country and live quietly, and the horrible thing is that it might have worked. Father was furious, but he was leaving us alone. But I just had to keep pushing. I gave Valerius my signet for a wedding ring, which granted him ownership of all my possessions and the power to sign documents in my name. It made sense at the time. He was 100 times smarter than me. Antony's tone turned soft and wistful again. Kinder, too. And I thought of him at once when he told me about Kenta and the worms. His first birthday after we met, Valerius asked me for this puppy that grew into the biggest dog I ever saw in my life, horribly spoiled. And then she whelped, and he couldn't bear to send any of the puppies off to be hunting dogs, so they just lived with him and my mother. And the hair on their clothes and furniture, you wouldn't believe. But that's not what we're talking about right now, is it? Hanyu wished it were. He wished Antony would keep talking about his mother and Valerius and their courtyard full of dogs. He didn't think he wanted to hear the rest of the story. I didn't see the king after word spread about my signet ring. We holed up in my mother's rooms while I had a house built for us on some land I owned, far from the castle. I wanted everything to be perfect for my husband. Kennels for his damn dogs, though I knew they'd all end up in the house no matter what. A huge greenhouse so he could cultivate all the plants he wanted. A room full of windows so I could paint him 100 times. We joked about adopting a horde of children, humans and elves both, and letting them run wild in the forest and bringing them to visit their aunt, King Claudia, with sticks and leaves still in their hair. Somehow, that was even more alarming than the idea of Antony having been married. The god had wanted children? Hanyu had never known anybody who even had the option of having children before. The priests were only allowed relationships with one another, and were sworn not to father children so that they could raise the offerings as their sons. The offerings themselves were permitted no family ties at all. The idea of somebody that Hanyu knew personally planning to have children was so exotic. What did that even feel like? Antony's voice turned dark, and Hanyu forced his mind back to the story. Then, one night, when we'd been married for about 3 months and the house was almost ready for us to move into, well, we still don't know exactly how it happened. Oh no, Hanyu braced himself. This was the bad part, the part he didn't want to hear. What we do know is that the curse was far too powerful to have been placed without the royal wizards, which means they had the king's permission, Antony snarled. There were 30 of those wizards, and their magic was bound to his orders, so we know that the curse was set by them and permitted by the king. What we don't know is why they chose such an extreme curse. Someone had a real sense of humor about things. Antony's lips twisted into a facsimile of a smile, but he certainly wasn't laughing. Hanyu was torn between wishing he would stop and wishing he would just get it over with and explain what had happened. All this talk about wizards and consorts was interesting enough, but Hanyu really only cared to hear what had happened to Antony and Valerius. His master went on. Whoever it was, my stepmother or half-sister or anyone else, they made the wizards design an incredibly elaborate curse based on a spook story the humans had back home. There were supposed to be these things called vampires, you see, and they were dead but still moving. They drank blood, turned to ashes in the sunlight, all of that. It must have been intended as a sick joke. I was meant to be cursed to become a human monster, kill my human husband, and then probably be executed as a warning to anyone else who would think about intermarrying. At least that much my father agreed to. There was so much hurt and anger in the god's voice that Hanyu was surprised he didn't choke on it. He wondered anew what it must be like to have a father. What kind of power must this man have held over Antony, that the betrayal still galled him 1,000 years later? His master took a breath, and when he started again, his tone was steadier. But they got too ambitious. They must have worded the curse so that it would also strike all my followers or allies or something similar. No doubt the casters intended to get rid of Claudia and Titus as well, and probably Theo. She had rich lands, no heir, and wasn't terribly popular at court. However, the king most likely wouldn't have agreed to include them in the curse explicitly. As far as he was concerned, they hadn't done anything to embarrass him. So the caster used vaguer wording, hoping it would be enough to get rid of my family and maybe a dozen other upstarts. Hanyu had 1,000 questions, but he didn't dare ask any of them. This raw, agonizing honesty felt like such a fragile thing. If he did anything to disrupt the flow of the god's words, he was afraid he would never hear the end of the story. That was their big mistake, Antony continued, with a smile that reminded Hanyu a little of the picture of the wolf. They didn't realize how large our faction was. There were over 100 of us, at least as far as we know. More had joined after I married Valerius. Of course, I wasn't the only elf who had fallen in love with a human or questioned their treatment. Anyhow, the strain of casting a spell of that magnitude must have killed the wizards. I think that was why we were able to escape. None of this made sense to Hanyu. All the talk of spells and wizards was fascinating, but so far outside his experience compared to the story of Antony and his star-crossed love. He was still afraid to speak, but he had to know the most important thing. "And Valerius?" he ventured in a whisper. Antony looked at a spot just over Hanyu's shoulder, refusing to meet his eyes. "The curse didn't extend to humans. It didn't touch him, but I did. When we were newly turned, we were feral, just animals. Human blood keeps us alive, but it isn't enough to give us our minds back. It has to be elves." He was speaking in present tense. What did that mean? Hanyu filed the question away with 100 others that the story had roused and forced himself to listen quietly. "We were still staying with Mother, so I went to sleep one night in my husband's arms and woke up with my mother's corpse in mine." Antony's voice had gone thick, but his face was set in a glare. "My teeth were still in her throat, and the dogs were all snarling and cowering away from me. I went running, calling for Valerius, and I found him in our bedroom. Apparently I had taken him first, then Mother." Hanyu realized he was crying, and he was glad of that, because Antony wasn't shedding so much as a single tear, even though his voice was practically choking and his hands were shaking. Hanyu felt that the least he could do in the face of this pain was cry in his master's stead. "The others came stumbling out into the palace complex and started finding each other. Most had killed a servant or neighbor and recovered themselves, but some had taken a sibling, a lover, a child. Titus had drained his best friend. Claudia and Theodora had been together that night, and when they came back to themselves, they were still together, and drinking from Theo's lady-in-waiting, the sweet younger girl that Theo treated like a little sister, and left out of all our schemes because she wanted to keep her safe. The same way we left our mother out of it." It was strange to think that if it hadn't been for that decision, Antony would have had a mother. Hanyu had never known anyone with a mother. On the one hand, the gentlewoman Antony had described didn't seem like she would have enjoyed a life of fighting and sailing, so perhaps it was for the best she hadn't been caught up in her children's fate. On the other hand, Hanyu felt that he would have liked to meet her. As for Theo's little maid, Antony grimaced. Claudia said that when they came to their senses, they both had their fangs in her throat, so close that their noses were touching. I think that's why Theo came with me. Claudia still loves her, but I don't know if Theo can stand to see my sister anymore after that moment. Hanyu wouldn't have thought that his heart could feel any more pity than it already did, but at this his tears redoubled. Poor Lord Theodora, so gentle with all her offerings. No one deserved to endure that kind of moment, but she deserved it even less than most. Claudia was the one who began figuring things out and gathering everyone together, of course, Antony went on. She realized almost at once that our magic wasn't working anymore, but she took a guard who had come to investigate the commotion and made her send messages to all our supporters. She gave everyone directions, quiet hallways, and unguided courtyards that they could traverse to get to the docks. She had had a ship prepared in case we ever needed to flee, though she hadn't expected it would be like this. No, Hanyu was fairly sure that even the famously cunning Lord Claudia would not have anticipated such a strange, cruel outcome. He swallowed down all his questions about the nature of those messages that would be able to reach people amidst such fear and chaos. This elf magic must have been an amazing force. No wonder his master regretted its loss. Antony fingered the end of his braid, still refusing to meet Hanyu's eyes. The alarm was still raised almost at once, of course. Lots of us had to fight our way free, and plenty never made it to the docks. I didn't even try, to be honest. I heard all our messages and directions, of course, but I ignored them. I think I would have just stayed there holding Valerius until they came to kill me. When Claudia realized what I was doing, she sent Thaddeus after me, of all people. If you can believe it, Thad picked me up and hoisted me over his shoulder and carried me to the docks, and he fucking cried and apologized the whole way. He just killed his sister, so neither of us was at our best right then. It was another image that Hanyu wished he could drive from his mind. Gentle Lord Thaddeus, bloody and shaking from his own transformation, weeping apologies as Antony sobbed and wailed into his soft back. Antony screaming, as if that would be enough to drive the taste of his husband and mother's lifeblood from his mouth. How did all the gods manage to walk around and live their lives after so much pain and horror? His master's voice was deliberately flat and featureless as he said, "So we drifted around for a while. There didn't seem to be much point in landing anywhere once we realized that sunlight hurt us and we could only eat blood. We were cramped in that boat like fingers on a fist, but luckily my loving father sent his soldiers on more ships to kill us. That didn't end well for them. I don't think that the casters had intended the curse to make us so resilient, but that was the way the magic interpreted their requirement that we be living dead. They had underestimated their own fucking spell." Hanyu was struck by the thought of what could have happened in that barely imaginable place if the gods had chosen vengeance rather than flight. Even if the wizards hadn't realized the magnitude of the spell they were casting, it had been incredibly reckless to take even the slightest risk of unleashing and angering that kind of power. Yes, the gods would probably have been overwhelmed by the elves' numbers, but what if they had been so mad with grief they'd chosen to go out in a fury of suicidal carnage? Antony went on. We were still as strong and fast as any other elves, more so in fact, and now we were very difficult to kill, so all my father's efforts accomplished was allowing us to spread out to 3 ships instead of 1, but we had to pace ourselves and keep from killing the handful of soldiers we had managed to take prisoner, so we were half feral and hungry. We were so hungry all the time, and half of us had broken hearts, and I think you wouldn't have been very impressed by us had you met us then. Hanyu didn't care how impressive they were or weren't. He just wanted to walk out onto the ship and wrap every single god in an enormous hug. Well, maybe not Lord Marcus. His master's voice was a little strained. It almost made it worse that they wouldn't just come out and admit it was my fault. Titus, Claudia, Theo, all of them were so damn kind about it. I know it all happened because of my recklessness and arrogance, and they all know it too. But even now, they've never said so. In those days, it must have been especially hard to restrain that urge. They were bad times. Was it possible that Lord Theodora truly held some secret resentment smothering in her chest? Hanyu had never sensed that from her at all. She got annoyed with his master sometimes, but mostly she just seemed to love him. Antony was still talking. We went on floating aimlessly in our little fleet of 3. It was, well, I don't suppose you've ever experienced the kind of hunger that comes from several months on sustained starvation rations. I certainly hadn't before then. Hanyu had never gone without a single meal in his life, except when he was sick. Once again, Antony was speaking about things entirely outside his range of experience. However, the look on the god's face and the way his hand moved, seemingly unconsciously, to cover his belly spoke volumes. We don't need to eat every day to be comfortable, as you've seen, but after 3 weeks with nothing at all? Antony shook his head. Your body starts to feel light and loose around you. Your hands shake and you lose your vision if you stand up too quickly. Your teeth, it's hard to describe. They feel hollow and ready to fall out. I don't know why we experience the physical feeling of hunger even though our bodies are so different now. I'm inclined to think it was explicitly layered into the curse just to be nasty. Anyhow, that's what happens after 3 weeks. What about 4? Hanyu whispered, fascinated against his will. Antony kept his eyes fixed on the wall. We were afraid to go past 4, not because we thought we'd die, but because we thought we might lose our minds. You start obsessing. All you can think about is food. You can't really concentrate on anything else. I was almost grateful for it at the time. Sustained thought wasn't exactly something I was enjoying. But I didn't want to go mad, so at the 4-week mark I took a mouthful every time. The god was carefully not mentioning the prisoners from whom they'd taken these tiny rations, but Hanyu guessed there was a whole other layer of misery there. They must have known some of the soldiers. Even if not, they were their own countrymen, sent to slaughter them for the crime of having been cursed. It must have been appalling to realize they were now the only available source of food. Despite his instinctive ire towards anyone who had planned to kill Antony, Hanyu felt a twinge of sympathy for the soldiers as well. It must have been terrible to be held prisoners by popular young royals and nobles, suddenly transformed into something new and strange. Those months must have been terrible for everyone involved. Antony's voice was still leveled, but a little hoarse as he continued. To make matters even worse, the ships were bursting with food. The soldiers had all had rations, and of course Claudia had laid in provisions on the ship she'd readied. So we were starving to death while surrounded by sacks of dried fruit and barrels of apples, potatoes, onions, the real solid foods we still fantasized about when we dreamed. Every time we bit in, though, it tasted like ashes, and if we still managed to swallow, we'd vomit it right up again. The same thing happened with blood from the thousands of fish we could see teeming around us. It was torture. I am never letting you go hungry again, Hanyu vowed silently. You will drink from me every other day, regular as a tide. I'll get Lord Theodora to make you do it if I have to. Felix taught us all the tricks he'd learned as a child to help ignore the hunger pains during bad harvests, the god went on, sending Hanyu's mind down more new, astonishing paths. But after 7 or 8 months, the only thing that really worked anymore was sleeping. We slept a lot those days when the pangs had led us. Antony sighed, ran his hand over the top of his head, and flinched. For the first time in this entire retelling, he met Hanyu's eyes squarely. His gaze was heavy and haunted, but strangely challenging. This is the part that he thinks will drive me away, Hanyu realized with a nervous jolt down his spine. So, the way we handled things with your ancestors, I don't really have any excuse except that we were hungry, Antony said. And that sounds like a ridiculous reason, unless you've ever been in a position where you make major life decisions based on food. It might not be a very noble or intellectually compelling motivator, but it's a powerful one. By the time we met the Taishans, we were desperate. And that's the only explanation I can give for what happened next.